This is Jeff Deist, and you're listening to the Human Action Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. This week, we are joined by a friend of mine, Daniel McAdams. Daniel, as many of you know, probably heads up the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And Daniel and I both share a background together as former staffers for Congressman Ron Paul in his office in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. So, Daniel, all that said, it's great to talk to you.
It's great to be back with you, Jeff.
Well, briefly, for any of our listeners who are unfamiliar, just give them a quick rundown of what the Ron Paul Institute is and what its mission is.
Well, I would say that we do three main things, Jeff. We're an educational charity, 501c3 charity. So our three sort of prongs are, we publish every day 3 or 4 articles, and we try to, they're highly curated. We want to show people the 3 or 4 things that you may want to be thinking about that day. And so that's the main thing. And we do the daily Ron Paul Liberty Report with Dr. Paul, Monday through Thursday with me as the co-host, and Friday with Chris Rossini as the co-host. And the other important part of what we do is conferences. And thankfully, this past year, we finally been able to get back to doing that. And we had 3 big events this year. We did something on Nixon's closing the gold window in Houston at a brewery. We had our normal Washington conference, which was our biggest conference ever. And we also had the Ron Paul Scholars Seminar, which is an event. This is our second annual one of those events for upper division undergrads and grad students, like a foreign policy boot camp. And we had a great one this time. We had Thomas Massey, Phil Giraldi, Jim Bovard. I mean, the lineup was terrific. Bumper Hornberger. So it was a great thing. And so these are the things that we're doing and what we're going to expand in the future. But again, it is focusing on foreign policy, but increasingly these past 2 years, Jeff, I would have to say civil liberties. And my own mind has been absolutely focused on civil liberties, probably to the near abandonment of foreign policy in some ways. But I think that goes without saying.
Well, I had the opportunity to attend your Washington, D.C. conference a month or so back, and it was definitely eclectic. There were a lot of different speakers on a lot of different topics, including the aforementioned Thomas Massey, but also RFK Jr. Talking about health freedom. So that was really fascinating to me, and I think kudos to you and to Ron Paul, because I think dollar for dollar, the Ron Paul Institute punches well above its weight in terms of influence. And the Liberty Report, of course, is a daily go-to for a lot of people. But certainly I'm biased in your favor. Now, I want to touch base a little bit about your past. When I met you, you had been living in Europe for several years, I believe, in Hungary specifically. And I'm told, or maybe it's a vicious rumor, that at one point in your early career, you even had some neoconish tendencies. So give us a little bit of the background.
Well, I don't know that it was neoconish tendencies, really. I mean, I was, when the Cold War ended, I had just finished up at UC Berkeley with a degree in English literature, which is, of course, as we all know, the most useful degree on earth, right? So we're in a recession in '88, and I have an English degree. And I had always wanted to do, actually, foreign affairs and politics, but was not able to do it. So I decided to go back to grad school and study international relations, which in some ways was a dumb move, but in some ways it was a very fortuitous move. But not necessarily neocon, but I went over to Europe and I watched the Clinton administration from the very beginning supporting the so-called reform communists. And I was pretty naive back then. I'll admit it. And I thought, these guys, they just must not know what's going on. They must not know the good guys and the bad guys. We got to support the good guys, not the guys that have been, exploiting people for decades. And, a lot of it's philosophical, Jeff, because there are sort of 2 ways of looking at the communist era. And one of those is that it's an aberration in history. It's something that came unique in a non-organic, non-evolutionary way. And so therefore, when you cut it out, if you look at it like the cancer that a lot of us believe it was, if you cut out that cancer, then you have 2 threads of history that are separated by several decades. In the Soviet Union's case, many decades. So the question is, do you rejoin those threads of history and move on in sort of an evolutionary, social evolutionary manner? Or do you view the communist era as a part of the normal evolution process, and therefore it wasn't an aberration of history, but just another part of history? And so I had fallen clearly on the side of it being an aberration, of being a cancer. And so I and a lot of the people, certainly in Hungary that I worked with, people in the Hungarian Democratic Forum, which was the first party to win the elections after communism, they looked at traditions pre-communism and wanted to revive a lot of those traditions, of course. But for the U.S. Embassy, that was anathema, because those were dark days. Those were the days of anti-Semitism, and that, which of course it wasn't at all. It was 1,000 years of Hungarian history, but that's sort of the philosophical breaking point of how you view the sort of historiography of 20th century Central and Eastern Europe.
So I know that while you were living in Eastern Europe, you had done some work with the British Helsinki group. So talk about that, and why are they controversial? The regime change, democracy for all types don't seem to like them.
No, they don't. And of course, those regime change, democracy for all people are now firmly ensconced on our shores. And we can talk about that later. But this is something we saw, my gosh, what is it, 30 years ago? 25 years ago, we saw this machine taking on a life of its own, and certainly eventually coming over to the West. But I was exposed to the British Helsinki group in a pretty simple way. I was at the time writing off and on for a newspaper called the Budapest Sun, which was the largest English language paper in Central and Eastern Europe. I eventually became the editorial page editor of the publication. But very early on, I'd noticed there was a good conservative writer, Jonathan Sunley, who's a brilliant British scholar. He studied under Professor Norman Stone, and eventually we became friends. And it turns out that Jonathan was involved with a group that was doing a lot of work over there that were skeptics of a lot of the received conventional wisdom over there, and a lot of it has to do with the last answer I gave, the view of history, and the view of whether or not, if you or your family were involved in the implementation of communism, if you have a right to remain in the vanguard of the change away from communism. And that's, of course, exactly what they all believed that they had the right to do. We will stay on top. That's why they're the ones, to a large degree, who managed the transition. In Hungary, it's called the rendszerváltás. The transition was managed by the same people who brought communism in. So, as it turns out, I had done, I spent a brief period in the State Department in intelligence, and by just pure happenstance, I was handed the Albania account in State Department's intelligence and research, because the person who was doing it normally was following Czechoslovakia's breakup very closely and didn't have time for Albania. So it was nice that it fell in my lap, and I wrote a lot of things for the secretary's daily briefing book, just because nobody wanted to do it. So that was known that I had a lot of experience in Albania. And so they said, hey, do you want to go to Vienna and testify at the OSCE? And do you want to take a trip to Albania and see this coup that was that was sort of starting up in 1996? And after that, of course, it was it was off to the races with this group, because they were definitely like-minded people.
So when you ultimately returned to the United States, this was right around 9/11 or thereabouts. How had you first heard of Ron Paul, and how did you come to work for him as his foreign policy guy?
Well, as I mentioned to a speech I gave to the LP Mises conference caucus a couple of weeks ago, my gateway drug was Justin Raimondo. It was through finding Justin, and I said it in my speech. I'm somewhat reluctant to say it now, but I was on a website back then. Kiddies may not remember that there weren't really websites as we know them now, but it was called Free Republic, and it was basically a right-wing site, wingnut site, and which hated Clinton, and I hated Clinton. I mean, I wasn't necessarily a right-winger, but I hated Clinton for a lot of reasons. And there was this guy that kept putting his articles up on Free Republic, and to being absolutely pummeled by these right-wing wingnuts, but it never deterred him. And that was Justin Raimondo. And he responded and responded and responded. And so I started reading Justin, and I started realizing, of course, in the late 90s, how right he was about what was happening in the Balkans, because I was literally next door. And it was through Justin, thank God, that I discovered Lou Rockwell and Ron Paul and so many of the other people who were saying the same thing. So indeed, it was thanks to Justin Raimondo that I started really questioning my idea that we've got to help the good guys because the bad guys are winning. And I started realizing that we should not be helping any guys. And that was my big revelation.
So could you have imagined, though, this is the late 90s, early 2000s, as you're having this awakening, could you at that point have imagined the Ron Paul revolutions of 2008 and 2012?
No, not at all. In fact, at the time, it was a shock to me because I wasn't that awfully interested in politics. I guess I was just sort of I was involved in Republicans Abroad, and it was mostly a social club because I was trying to find a way to get some connections and make some dough. But at the time, even what little I knew of Congress, we did have the Gingrich Revolution while I was over there. So I, at that time, was foolishly thought, oh, the good guys are going to start doing really good things. And of course, I was wrong. But here's this obscure Texas congressman. He didn't seem like a right winger. He was I didn't understand it. I couldn't peg him because I didn't understand libertarianism at the time. I remember my father-in-law used to always say that he was libertarian, and I really didn't know what it meant, except that he thought that, you shouldn't be put in jail for drugs, which I disagreed with him on at the time. So no, I never could have foreseen it, even having worked for him for 6 or so years before the revolution took off. It was, we were always fighting rearguard actions. We were always, throwing in, metaphorical bombs into the machine to try to slow things up and to try to at least make some points. So the idea that all of this would coalesce into, a worldwide historic movement that, will be written about, that is written about in history books, it never would have really occurred to me at the time.
Those years you spent as Dr. Paul's representative on the House International Relations Committee, I know within those years, Henry Hyde was the chairman of that committee. I don't recall who else was, but what was Ron's impact being on that committee? Why did they let him sit on that committee?
Well, he was on the committee before I was hired. And I think my experience, I had been writing for Lou Rockwell in anti-war. And I think that's what helped me. He needed, our good friend Joe Becker, who's now with you guys at Mises. He wanted to move on. He'd been there for he thought, enough time. And so they needed someone that could handle Ron's foreign affairs stuff. So I was just dumb luck. I fit the bill, when it came to that. But it was not easy for him to get on international relations. He had tried before, and he was told that he wasn't sufficiently loyal to a different state, which is Israel, to be considered acceptable to be on the committee. But eventually he was offered a position there. And I think they probably regretted it, particularly as, we faced the run up to the Iraq War, the years of the Iraq War, the Patriot Act, et cetera, et cetera. They probably regretted letting him on the committee.
But it did provide him some excellent opportunities over the years to make his case.
Oh, yeah. I mean, every time it came to his turn, the eyes were rolling. Oh, my God, this is not going to be easy. Here he goes again. But over and over again, he just made such crisp points, such perfect points. He never let anything slip by him. And, as everyone knows, he did it in his calm manner. He wasn't pounding the table. He wasn't acting like a buffoon like so many other members. He just simply assailed them with facts and with analysis. And that's why they hated him the most, especially Tom Lantos, who was the chairman for a brief period of time.
What's so interesting about Ron is that he was motivated basically by two things in deciding to run for Congress: foreign policy and monetary policy. And you know this better than me, is that he was able to dovetail those two things. In other words, he understood that everything is economics and that interventionism abroad is a cousin of interventionism at home in the economy.
Absolutely, and and this is something that the neocons and most conservatives, people that would call themselves conservatives, never understand, because if you told them, those of them who agree with us on domestic policy, hey, the government shouldn't be telling you what to do. They shouldn't be telling you what your taxes, should be. They shouldn't be telling you how to run your business. Those same people believe that 6,000 miles away, all of a sudden the government becomes omniscient and omnipotent, and so there's such a huge disconnect. And the reason is very, very simple. They never have to live with the consequences of the policies that they promote overseas. They never have to live in a Ukraine that's been destroyed by the Maidan. They never have to go back and live in Libya, which has been a nightmare since we quote liberated it. So they never have to face the consequences of the policies that they support and promote. So therefore, they continue to promote them, and they will probably until the whole thing comes down, which who knows, may be imminent.
Well, it's interesting if you go back and look at the Constitution, there's no distinction made or no language whatsoever about foreign policy and domestic policy. And yet, up until recently, maybe Trump, there used to be a bit of a gentleman's agreement in Congress that politics stops at the water's edge. And I think that was allowed for a lot of interventionism to go unremarked with bipartisan support.
You're right. You're absolutely right, Jeff. And it was a very convenient tool for the interventionists because, after all, those are our boys over there. And anything you say that might put them in danger questions your patriotism. So that was used a lot to solidify support for intervention overseas. There's no question about that.
Well, I want to talk about whether there is a Ron Paul doctrine. And it would, of course, have to meld these two things, economics and foreign policy. And I was rereading Mises's Liberalism the other day for a talk I had given somewhere else. And that book is just start to finish. I mean, 100 and barely 200 pages, just jam-packed. And so it struck me that Mises's prescription for a liberal society or even a liberal nationalism was very much in keeping with what I would say is a Ron Paul doctrine, which means laissez-faire at home, leaving people be to go their own ways with decentralization, even up to and including secession, having free trade, which of course keeps us away from the problems of autarky and needing to do everything domestically. And then finally, a strictly, rigidly non-interventionist foreign policy abroad. So it's sort of four elements to Mises's prescription for a liberal society. And it struck me, and sorry for being so wordy here, Daniel, but that those same four elements are a good description of what we might call a Ron Paul doctrine.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think that is. And I think, at its core, a Ron Paul doctrine would be resisting the temptation of authoritarian impulses, because they're there, they're everywhere. And the thing about Ron, and I work with him now a lot more closely than I did on the Hill, as you know. I mean, we only went in there when we had an issue. Normally, we left him alone. And I work with him daily now, and it's evident in every aspect of his life, including his interpersonal relationships, is resisting the impulse to authoritarianism or to any kind of intervention. And, sometimes that's been a little difficult. Sometimes there were maybe some staffers who needed a little more intervention. But Ron would always hope that they would straighten up and fly right. He always hoped that people would do the right thing. But he was always want to tell people what that right thing was. And I think it's so much encapsulated, almost in a bumper sticker. Well, what should I do? Well, do what you want to do. What should I do to promote liberty? Well, do what you want to do. Do what you're good at. And I think that is at its core, and I don't know if it's a kind of a Protestant work ethic or if it's the way he was raised in circumstances where hard work paid off to a successful career, to a successful life. One that started, in very difficult circumstances. If you know about his past and about how his ancestors came over from Germany with literally nothing in their pockets, and hard work provided them the American dream. I think that's really kind of who Ron Paul is, because he understands what that's like.
Yeah, and I mentioned this one time at an event we held at Ron's home, where I said, I wish some of his critics would deliver 1,000 babies before they began criticizing him, because he's delivered 4,000.
Yeah.
But
or how about riding around in a horse-drawn carriage delivering milk at 7 years old, right?
Yes.
Why don't you try that?
Yes, for his father's dairy, which people who have read his biography will know about.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the schisms even amongst libertarians. Ron has always been a bit of a lightning rod, and there's always been a split between what we might call DC libertarians and Ron Paul libertarians in the Mises Institute. And if we're going to apply a tougher appellation to them, we might call them regime libertarians. In other words, there have always been people in those circles who say, Ron Paul ends up making apologies for foreign dictators because his non-interventionism is blind. And so over the years, I know you've also been on the receiving end of some of these criticisms. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's the issue of staying out of other people's business at home and abroad. And I talked about this a little bit at the speech I gave earlier this month. There's sort of a Trotskyist faction of libertarians who believe that a libertarian government overseas imposed by force in this permanent revolution is the only way we can have freedom in the world. And there are these sort of liberal messianic interventionists who do want to have libertarianism here first, but who do also ultimately want to export that overseas. And then there are what I call the live and let live libertarians, which understand that people in a country, for example, Iran, may want to live under a theocracy, and it's just none of our damn business if they do. And I suggest that as a sort of a pressure release system that perhaps you might let some more immigrate who don't want to live in that, but otherwise people should be free to live as they wish, or even in Yugoslavia if they want to have, or in Venezuela if they want to have a socialist system. Now, eventually there are always evolutionary changes, of course, and unfortunately our evolutionary changes are not going in the right direction. But that when you subject that to external pressure, you move from evolutionary changes to a revolutionary change, which is there's just no example in history where us being the vanguard of democratic revolutionary change overseas has ever produced positive results. And all of this comes from understanding the Ron Paul Doctrine, as you say, and how Ron Paul views the world. And he's not anyone who follows him knows that he's not bashful about criticizing Venezuela's economic policy, but it's just he doesn't take it to the next step of calling for us to liberate the people there.
Well, Justin Raimondo received a lot of grief, too, over the years for being strict about this rather than saying it's our job to shape the world or impose our will on the world. What strikes me, Daniel, is there's so much economic ignorance in the neoconservative worldview. In other words, we don't have the money, we don't have the dough. Almost all wars and police actions and all nation building, it's all debt financed. And that if people really understood economics, they would know that a grandiose foreign policy worldview like a Bill Kristol is just flat incompatible with so-called limited government, which is supposed to be a conservative shibboleth.
That's absolutely true. And the more I understand how things work, the more I also understand that it's not necessarily ideological. People like Bill Kristol live very good lives because they do the bidding of the defense contractors in the military-industrial complex. And we're seeing so much of that now. We're looking at now the medical industrial complex, the pharma industrial complex. These are special interests that literally have Congress in a chokehold, and they've produced probably the Cold War itself. I think if we want to be revisionist, but certainly the post-Cold War era and the maintenance and expansion of the U.S. empire has all been driven by the weapons manufacturers. So it's partially ideological, but that ideology is awfully convenient when it leads you to live a better life than normally you would live as a humble scribbler like Kristol would have been.
Yeah, it's interesting. Here's an analogy for you. There's obviously crossover. Someone like a Mary Cheney agrees with Joe Biden on foreign policy, and there's this kind of, Mitt Romney types who will agree with Terry McAuliffe, who might be the next governor in Virginia.
God help us.
But we've also established some interesting and strange bedfellows on left and right from our perspective. In other words, there's voices out there like Dennis Kucinich and Jimmy Dore and Caitlin Johnstone down in Australia, aligning with people like you and the aforementioned Raimondo and Ron Paul. So I do think there's an opportunity there. I do think that these endless foreign wars are not popular outside the Beltway.
I do, and I'm actually, this is one of the few areas I have to admit that I'm slightly optimistic still. Most of the things, unlike Ron, I've developed this sort of overwhelming dark pessimism. But I think if anything, certainly the foreign policy, but also this entire year and a half or 2 years of COVID tyranny has exposed a lot of the people that I was worried might come down on the other side because they were progressives, has really reassured me. And people like Glenn Greenwald, slightly a latecomer to the whole thing, but Matt Taibbi, as you say, Jimmy Dore, who's so terrific on this issue. Some of the people that I've known on foreign policy, Vanessa Beeley and her group, Whitney Webb, these are great writers, and they've all come down as anti-authoritarians, where a lot of their allies or once allies on the left have firmly come down in the camp of the CIA, of the Patriot Act, of don't question, you are in a resistance, but don't you dare resist the authorities, insurrection, So thankfully, these ties, these cross aisle, as you would say, ties, have not only managed to survive the COVID tyranny, but I think they've been fertilized by it. So there is a little bit of optimism for me, at least in this point.
Yeah, and I think the COVID regime has to be viewed like the interventionist regime overseas. I mean, these are part and parcel of the same beast. One thing you've mentioned before in talks is the Rockwell rule, named after Lew Rockwell. So we had mentioned regime libertarians earlier who want you to browbeat every tin pot dictator and tell, in other words, they want you to be against actual military intervention and maybe even against economic intervention in the form of sanctions, but they want you to join the chorus of browbeaters to sort of show your patriotism. So what's the Rockwell rule, and what can we learn from it?
It's very simply, never, ever, ever, in any regime that the CIA wants to overthrow, never, ever repeat their talking points. Never criticize any regime that the CIA wants to overthrow. Full stop. And that is the Rockwell rule, the Rockwell Doctrine, and it deprives the interventionists of the ability to say, see, even the libertarians agree that Gaddafi is passing out Viagra or that Saddam is eating babies, and they can say, oh yeah, the libertarians, they don't want to invade, whatever. But see, even they agree. So deprive them of that ability. And Caitlin Johnstone has a good way of saying it. Don't be a CIA mouthpiece. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is very, very important. And it's so funny because you do see these things at exactly the right moment that the CIA and that the regime change machine wants you to say it. When they're ramping up the heat on Iran, all of a sudden you'll have some young libertarian gal come out and say, Iran is a horrible despotism. They're socialist in their economy and this sort of thing. It always comes at the exact right moment. And so if you're a libertarian and you participate in this, you're a dupe or worse.
Yeah, it strikes me there's a tremendous amount of hubris in the West today that the whole world has to share our principles and our form of governance, which would basically be, I suppose, social democracy with a healthy, robust safety net, and that we have to have, international governance in the form of the United Nations or the World Bank or whatever it might be. And from my perspective, Daniel, this is just the 21st century's version of imperialism and colonialism. It's just ideological colonialism.
Yeah, and worse, because we can kill a lot more people a lot quicker. I mean, the people that jump on the bandwagon, we've got to do this, we've got to overthrow X. You are living in a country whose foreign policy and military leadership are responsible for the deaths of millions. You have a president who just droned a family and then lied about it, started wars forever, who's now holding, nearly 100 people in a gulag in D.C. because they happened to set foot in the Capitol building on January 6th. This is one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And if you doubt that, step out of line. Yet, nevertheless, if there's a bad guy overseas, we got to jump in and join the chorus and join the 2 minutes of hate against him to keep this evil regime up and running, to keep the dollars flowing to the overt and covert regime change mechanism here at home. So the thing is, just don't buy into it. Bite your tongue. Okay, the guy's a jerk overseas, probably true, but we got a hell of a lot bigger of jerks running the State Department, running the military industrial complex right here at home.
Well, I'd like to get your take on some current issues in foreign affairs. Let's start with China, and Taiwan. I'm interested in Biden's saber rattling and talking to the Japanese about potential joint naval exercises. I wonder offhand, there's an awful lot of Chinese Americans. I wonder what they would think of Biden if he joined forces with the Japanese to rattle sabers against China.
That's an interesting point, and it's one that it's a variable I don't think has been considered much. From my experience, now I may be wrong, but from my experience, I think the Chinese Americans in the U.S. tend to be rather apolitical. They're not as involved in politics as other immigrant groups. At least at this point, they have not. Again, this is a sweeping generalism, but they tend to keep their heads down and become very successful in business and academia. But there might be some triggers for that. You have a lot of Chinese in the U.S. and they have ties to their homeland. They retain those ties. So I think you could see some pushback. I don't think it would be. I think it would be something that would be very new, but it might be something that does eventually come about.
But given our recent problems in Afghanistan, for example, is the United States military equipped at all to take on China?
And there's an article that it's escaping me right now, but it's a good article I started and, of course, didn't finish like a lot of the times. But it's looking at numbers, and a lot of Americans on the right are falling out of love with the military, and that's a very good thing. They're stopping this military worship, and it's because of the wokeness that's gone on in there. But that is a good question. Are we really going to provoke a war with China when we can't beat a bunch of barefooted people? After 20 years of war? Well, I think that's all by design too. They didn't want the Afghanistan war to end because it's a gravy train. Whereas I think a war with China would be pretty quick and decisive. So are they equipped? No, but they're not. They weren't equipped for Iraq. They weren't equipped for Afghanistan. They've not been equipped for any war, frankly. You even could go back to World War I and II, right? We kind of came in at the end of World War I when things were pretty settled. So, yeah, it's the whole thing is a complete scam, Jeff. It's a huge ripoff. It's a huge psyop against the American people.
But even amongst Mises Institute readers and fans, and certainly amongst broader libertarian audiences, there are people who say China is a real threat to the United States. China is biding its time and hoping that we have an economic fall here, and that libertarians like those at the Mises Institute who talk about secession would simply open the door for a weakened America or a weakened, broken up America to let the Chinese lion in.
It's hilarious. What the hell would they do? Right? All right, we got California. This is awesome. It's so funny. I had lunch when I was back in D.C. with my good friend Colonel McGregor, and he said, our military is still fighting the idea of territorial warfare. The rest of the world has given up on this idea. You don't go and fight and take over. We're right now, we've taken over 30% of Syria. What the hell are we doing there? Nobody knows. We're the only country in the world that goes around looking to put in bases and get territory overseas. What does it give us? It seems to me the last thing that Chinese would ever want would be to, quote, own most of the U.S. First of all, it's a basket case. They've got their own basket case over there because of their, the economic problems they have. Why would they want to inherit something worse? And why would they want to, the distortions in our economy that would result in would be we wouldn't buy their stuff anymore. So it would be a disaster. The real Chinese threat is that the Chinese do capitalism better than we do. We go overseas and we overthrow governments. We take over media. We push people around. We push gay rights. The Chinese go over and make business deals in foreign countries, and they get the stuff they want. They get the rare earths. They get whatever they need. They build factories. And that's the real reason that the Chinese will certainly outpace us, I think, in the future. But instead of addressing that aspect and returning to a non-interventionist foreign policy at home and abroad, domestic policy and foreign policy, we actually are doing the things that make it more likely that they will overtake us in the one area that they're outperforming us. So scratch your heads on that one, really.
Talk about Turkey and Erdogan. Just 10 or 15 years ago, he was the darling of the West, and Turkey was going to join the Eurozone. Now he's a devil.
He's a devil now because he's pretty wily. He knows how to do business with Putin. He's not chewing on the sound bites that NATO wants to give him. He purchased the S-400s now, and that makes him unqualified to participate in the F-35 project. Although we're still holding, I think, $1 billion of his dollars. And I think we're dangling some F-16s in front of him. Probably best to take the F-16s over the 35s, actually. But, his support, he's a populist. His support comes from the countryside. It comes from the religious countryside. I'm not particularly a huge fan of his, but I did find it interesting, and I find it difficult to avoid cheering from him when he told those 10 Western ambassadors, including the U.S. last week, hey, you signed a letter dealing with something that we're dealing with in our internal judicial system. You're persona non grata, get out of the country. And it wasn't until these 11 countries backed down, 10 countries backed down, that he said, okay, you guys can stay. But he's not having it, and I still, it's hard for me to believe, Russia got it, Putin got it, but a country like Belarus has been on the receiving end of U.S. regime change efforts for so long, still allows some Western NGOs in the country. And that just seems stupid to me. And I think Erdogan has woken up to that. He's woken up to what's happening. And regardless of how you feel about his policies or his authoritarianism, if you don't like the U.S. empire because it hurts us and hurts people overseas, you kind of have to have a positive view of that.
How about Iran? Are they actually developing nuclear energy or nuclear weapons, or neither?
Well, they've been about 20 minutes away from a nuclear bomb for the past 30 years. So either they're taking a long coffee break, or it's, once again, Israel having a conniption fit as they always do, and the U.S. following suit. Again, it's the same people driving it, the military-industrial complex. The Israelis, because they have such moral hazard, because we subsidize their military so much, they don't have an incentive to make peace with their neighbors because they believe that the U.S. has their back no matter what they do. Now, this is not a healthy policy for Israel in any sense of the word, and it's certainly not a healthy policy for us. The best policy would be for us to disengage. And Massey, Thomas Massey got in big trouble because he voted against $1 billion for their Iron Dome. They basically start bombing their neighbors and piss them off, and then their neighbors shoot back, and they put up their Iron Dome. And oh my gosh, we've expended all our domes. Give us some more. But we subsidized a policy in Israel that's very dangerous to Israel. And if we didn't do that, they would have to find a way to deal with their neighbors and find peace. And they probably would, because there are a lot of things they have in common, believe it or not. Certainly, as we know, Iran has the largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the world. I think aside from the U.S. But so the Iran policy is a disaster under Trump, disaster under Biden, because I don't know what the Biden foreign policy is, to be quite honest with you. But certainly the Biden administration is trying to have it both ways. They promised to go back to the Joint Comprehensive Agreement, the JCPOA, but they can't do it because they're having a lot of pressure from the pro-Israel faction that you have to get additional concessions. And Iran is saying, what are you talking about? We already went through this whole thing. We made an agreement. Why would we give up more than what we initially signed on to. And, the whole irony of it, the humor of it, is that we're pushing Iran more firmly into the camp of Russia and China. They say, hey, if you want to deal with us, we're going to go ahead and sell some oil to China. And China says, okay, we'll take it. Sounds good. So we're actually the authors of our own demise with our stupid foreign policy.
Finally, give us your take on Russia and Putin.
Well, it was an interesting talk that he gave to the Valdai discussion group this past week, I think it was, where he talked about the wokeism in the U.S. and he talked about how we seem to be devouring ourselves and how he remembers in their own history what happened when the Soviets came and tried to suppress speech and tried to suppress normal life, as the wokeists in America are doing, and how it's very well recognized in Russia what's happening in the U.S. and basically essentially saying that Russia is probably the last conservative, for better or worse, whatever the word means, conservative country on earth. So it's and I know that makes a lot of anti-wokeists feel like Russia is the answer, is the paradise. But I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And I think one of the things we've seen from COVID is that there's still a lot of authoritarian impulses there that we might not necessarily like. But anyone interested in there's I forget who wrote the excerpts, but there are plenty of excerpts from that speech. I think it was a 3-hour speech. Imagine Joe Biden giving a very detailed 3-hour talk on anything. But it's very, very, very interesting. And I really highly recommend that the listeners take a look at what he had to say.
Well, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not, but in 1959, that's a long time ago now, Murray Rothbard wrote a letter to Ken Templeton, who was one of the people at the Volcker Fund. The Volcker Fund was supporting Rothbard's writings in the 50s, especially of Man, Economy, and State. And I'm quoting Rothbard. He said, I've decided that the war-peace question is key to this whole libertarian business. What a great quote. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is the key quote.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for your time today. I want to thank Daniel McAdams for joining us and for everything he does at the Ron Paul Institute. And I want to wish everybody a great weekend.
The Human Action Podcast is available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and on Mises.org. Subscribe to get new episodes every week and find more content like this on Mises.org.